thing I brought, because we get these all the time. There are, to start out also, there are too many books, but some of them, like this is one called Writing the NIH Grant Proposal. Very new. I don't know how good it is for IES or criminology, but it breaks it down, each section, because you have to fill in the outline, basically, what they're looking for in each section and what the grading criteria are, basically. Because that's how reviewers are doing it. So they open up the review process and say, we're not looking for a clever quote here or a case study. We want 3 sentences on the impact. So there's that one. I have like a lot of institutes put out their own. So this is National Cancer Institute that I get most of my funding from. And it's everything you wanted to know about the NCI grants process, but we're afraid to ask. It's online. You click a button and get it sent for free. And other institutes have that. Deborah Vizzi had given me, for teaching a couple of years ago, a little book on evaluating research proposals that's often handed out to reviewers. So another thing, when you said people get and give good grant proposals, the other thing is hook on to your mentors and your faculty, even if they're not in your area, who sit on review panels, who can then show you, even if it's not in your area, what a successful and not successful grant looks like. Or while they're working on one, you could say, if there's not a confidentiality issue, could I sort of read it and could we have a discussion so I could hear, as a grad student you may pick up everything from, Cooking Campbell that was wrong, but that may not be the way reviewers think. So one of my colleagues talks about writing grants as defensive writing. You're defending your ideas to people whose job is to say, what's the problem here? And it's a different kind of writing than we do when we write articles and try to build things up. So, so there's also, without people, you can look at words as well, though I think the people, the mentoring and the network part is important. Let me open, because we don't have, no, I'm even looking at that clock. Because we only have about another 10 or 15 minutes. Let me open it up for some questions. Since you've got the people, you would have to call on the phone here in some sense. So just jump in, yeah.
Hi, I have a question concerning community-based participatory research and grant writing, because oftentimes, the grants want to know what you're going to do and what the outcomes will be. And when you're working in communities and you're saying, well, I'm going to go in, but I want to let the community tell me what it is they need, so you don't necessarily have the answers before you get to, or while you're writing the grant, because you're waiting for it from the community. So how can you negotiate that in grant writing?
Seems to me pilot work. I mean that's a situation in which you're going to have to do some of that community-based work first and have a plan. I mean, because
like a starting
plan. I mean, it might shift a little bit while you're in there, but you have to have some sense of a plan. They're not going to say, I don't know of an agency, there may be one where you say, I want to go into this community and see what they want. They're not going to give you
Michelle,
money.
you've done a lot.
And I think that,
Move to Canada. Because actually the Canadian federal government is very interested in this kind of work. There are private foundations, but there are there are federal agencies. Folks who work on disability studies, for instance, more or less insist that the work be participatory. But I share Margaret's sense that you need to have a design in mind, right? And so either you've got some kind of an advisory group that's helping you shape that design, but students here sometimes say, how can I go to the IRB if it's participatory? You have to have a plan in mind and a rigorous design, and you might even indicate the things that might change, where you could then go back and check in with the program officer or whomever, or the IRB. But I think you're not going to get funding or IRB approval for just leaving it wide open. Even if it's semi-fiction, I think having a plan, but then building in a process where community is going to determine, is this design work, is this sample right, are these the right measures, are these the right outcomes, are these the right questions, and then getting back to both the funder and the IRB. But I think the days are over, if there ever were days of doing community work that's just kind of wide open and getting funded. It's kind of too risky. I mean, even if I were giving out money, I would want to know I can hold you accountable for something, even if part of what I'm holding you accountable for is an authentic checking in with community. Is that Makes sense. That's certainly how I've worked with private foundations, and then some federal government organizations will actually insist on participatory work. Some of the HIV work, when ACT UP kind of insisted on community-based participation, and the disability studies area where disability rights groups said we're tired of non-disabled people doing research on us and then documenting their anxieties about becoming disabled. That the research must be participatory. So I think you can build it in as a part of your design, but I think you need a research frame.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely right. You know, we have a good example where we, when I first came to MDRC, Bob Granger, who actually now heads up the Women T Grant Foundation, wanted to do an interesting project where we were trying to understand the effects of welfare and employment policies on kids, and he wanted to build it by talking to policymakers. So it was purposely vague, the proposal, saying we've got these great data, but we want to build from the policymakers themselves about what questions they want us to answer. And we kept getting feedback from foundations saying, you're not being specific enough, we have no idea what you're going to do, we can't just give you a promissory note here, you know. And basically we had to come up with examples, at least, for a framework for understanding how we would determine, a framework for determining the questions, and good examples of the kinds of things we were probably going to address.
We're in this business where people are constantly telling us what we did wrong, as well, not as much what you did right. You really need those sentences in a review where they say this is very innovative, or wow, you grabbed onto something. And you have to keep going back and reading the earlier sentences. But you know, all of us, I think, at one point or another, took a proposal or an article, stuck it in the file drawer, and said, I just don't want to look at that again. Especially the third time, which of course, it also helps to have a collaborator like I do, who then called NIH and said, we are 1/10 of a point away. We've done everything. You said we did everything. This is ridiculous, and got us funded. I would never have done that. I'm sitting in the bathroom crying. He's calling NIH, so you have to pick your collaborators well, too. But I think part of it is this notion of it's going to be a long-term process. From what I heard, to just sum up for the panel a little bit, is this notion of really, it's a preparation that starts very early, before any kind of target deadline or due date, where you're just feeling out the agencies and the people and the websites and where you should send it while you're starting to write it. And then as you're writing it, you have to keep giving it to what we call here sometimes friendly enemies. So Michelle and I will look at each other's stuff with the idea of really trying to find everything wrong. So we do that before it goes into an agency, and we do it because we don't do the same kind of work. It's that, you know, you don't have just specialists reading your stuff, you have people who don't know this area, so you've got to be clear to them. And then you turn it in and you take a breath and start on the other thing. But then here come back the reviews, and it's the last thing you want to do, but you have to go back and revise it, and you have to use the feedback. And the first thing is you do spend most of your time going, they don't know what they're talking about, they're assholes, blah, 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 blah. And then you have to go back point by point. And in fact, with, and again, I don't know if it's the same with NIH grants, you now have 3 pages on a revised grant where you are supposed to address the reviewers point by point, the way you do with a journal letter, before they even get to your revised grant.
And that's, no, it's not, because there are no revisions, and so,
right, it's a new grant.
So it's always a new submission every time, and so that's the hard thing with the NSF ones, because you want to be able to say, this reviewer was nuts because they said this, and you know, but you can't, there's no, it's very difficult to address a review, because sometimes reviewers just miss the, you know, miss the boat, and if you, but it's not a revision, really. And so it's sometimes hard to address that, and you have to be creative about how to work in. Some people might think that this, and here's why it's not that. But you have to write it in a way knowing that it could go to a completely new person who doesn't understand the history of it. The panel will understand the history of it, likely. The program officer will, but the person reading it, so you have to write it in a way that it reads well for a fresh set of eyes, too.